the Excel sheets that I've shared with you. So I have uploaded in the chat box also. I think you can read it from there. It's from Ponraj. The first question.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, I've got a couple of questions here from Ponraj. He asks, so when birds move to high elevations due to climate change, so birds are moving in mountains, they're moving upwards because of climate change to track temperatures, especially in tropical mountains. How do they adapt to higher elevation challenges like low O2 levels? That's a great question. And the answer to that is that we don't know yet. Um, our, Most of our understanding about bird movements upslope comes from neotropical mountains that are not very, very high. So they've come from, for example, parts of the Andes mountain range, where the summits of these mountains are 1400, 1500 meters above sea level. So the mountains themselves are not very high. And oxygen is not a problem for when you have such a low um, mountain summit. But in other parts of the Andes, where you can go up to about 6,000 meters above sea level, and the Himalayas, because the Himalayas are the tallest mountain range on Earth, when these bird species start moving up, what do they do? How do they deal with reduced oxygen? Something that needs to be investigated. At a at a smaller time scale. Now, when we're talking about range shifts, we're talking about the entire range of the species shifting upwards. Right? This is not migration. But there are a number of species that breed at very, very high elevations. They breed at 3,500, 4,000 meters above sea level, and they winter very low down. They even winter in the plains, so they might be wintering at about 100, 150 meters above sea level. So I think there has been some work done by people like Sahas Barve uh, on, I've just put his name into the chat box there, on Himalayan birds and hemoglobin, and how exactly birds that are found, species or populations that are found at different elevations, what is the difference in the hemoglobin makeup of the blood of these populations at different elevations? That you can look at that at a more sort of smaller time scale. Climate change is operating over larger time scales, whereas migration happens every year. So the rain shifts, what happens with the rain shifts, we still need to see when it comes to oxygen availability. But there might be some clues as to what might happen based on our information from altitudinal migration and looking at hemoglobin compositions and blood hemoglobin levels at different elevations. Is there any study about impact of birds in invasive plants? Um, I'm sorry, I don't really study invasive plants. I study more climate change and land usage, so habitat degradation. So I might not know offhand if there are any such studies. There have been a large number of studies between invasive plants and their pollinators, like butterflies. And there have been some studies on invasive plants and their dispersers, birds, but I'm not aware of anything from India at the moment. I think it's open to very much open to study, and it's an important, exceptionally important topic because along with climate change, invasive species are becoming the most important threat to biodiversity nowadays. We got species like lantana, we got species like Senna spectabilis that are just taking over forests, and how these species are dispersed, what is the role that birds play in dispersing these invasive plants, and therefore what impact do these invasive plants have on birds is something that we really need to understand. I would imagine that with species of plants like lantana, where the berries are very, very attractive to birds like bulbuls. Uh, I would imagine that actually the spread of lantana has been good uh, in in, uh, in providing a source of nutrition for small fruit-eating bird species like bulbuls. Of course, it might have completely other impacts on other bird species. So, because lantana chokes the vegetation and prevents native trees from regenerating or native vegetation from regenerating, species that depend on native vegetation are likely to lose because of the spread of lantana, whereas other species that are more adaptable, like smaller bodied fruit eating species, might actually gain from the spread of invasive species like lantana, but um, it's likely to vary based on which invasive plant we're talking about and what its properties are. It's something that really needs to be researched in today's context.
Okay. Hello everyone. I think you can start posting your questions in the chat box. And in the meantime, is it okay if I post questions from the discussion forum also here? Umesh, you can address them directly here, I guess. So if it is okay.
Sure, sure.
S-
Thanks, Sonia.
mm. So the first
From
question is from
Sachin,
Sachin. Yeah.
yeah, I've got that in the chat box here. From Sachin, how do researchers control the access of a species to an experiment? In this case, when a sentinel species is removed, why wouldn't another individual of the same species join the flock to take up the sentinel role? Um, so over time, so this is an experiment where with mixed species bird flocks, and mixed species bird flocks are very cohesive tight groups of multiple species, and different species play different roles in these mixed species bird flocks. Some of these species are what are called nuclear. Um, that is very, very important for the initiation and the maintenance of these flocks. One of the kinds of nuclear species that is our sentinel species. Sentinels are very, very good at detecting predators and warning other members of the flock that there is a predator. So those sentinel species are very, very important in maintaining flock cohesion, because a lot of species want to be in the company of sentinel species so that they do get early warnings against predators. Now, in this experiment, what happened was the researchers they caught the sentinel species pair from the flock, and they kept it in a cage for 3 days, and then released it back into the flock. And they found that the behavior of these mixed flocks changes in the absence of the sentinel species. They're foraging in more dense vegetation where it's in the absence of the sentinel, where presumably it's more difficult for the predator to find them and attack them. So they shift their behavior in the absence of sentinels. Now, over a long period of time, Sachin, you're definitely right in that um, that vacancy that the sentinel is absent from this flock will be detected by other members of the same species, and they will join that flock finally. Yeah, that's absolutely true. But over these shorter time periods, now these flocks are very, very territorial, and they've got a very, very specific composition. So if you remove the sentinel species for 3 days, that's not enough time for that vacancy of that role to be detected in the flock by other individuals of the same species. But if you remove the sentinel, for example, permanently, then definitely that vacancy will be detected and filled by other individuals of the sentinel species.
I'll pose the next question as well then.
Govind asks, how exactly does the replacement zone culture work? I think Govind is referring to the ranges of species on elevational gradients. And when you find that you go from the bottom of a mountain to the top, you'll often find very closely related species replacing each other in the elevation. So the low elevations might have one species of sunbird that goes up to 1800 meters above sea level, and then from 1800 meters you have another species from the same genus of sunbird uh, starting at 1800 meters and maybe going up to 2800 meters. So species that are closely related replace each other, and there is a replacement zone where one species stops and another species starts. Now, the replacement zone, from some of the studies that have been done in the Andes Mountains, it looks like the replacement zone works because of territoriality and aggression between interspecies aggression. So at the replacement zone, what happens is species A is at low elevation, species B is at a higher elevation, and there's a replacement zone. But at the replacement zone, territories occupied by species A will not be occupied by species B, and they will not coexist in the same territories. And that's because they respond aggressively to each other at the replacement zone, right? So the replacement zone is maintained by territoriality and what's called interference competition. So if you look at the community ecology session, then there is a lot of talk about competition and interference competitions when two individuals directly interact and compete for some resource, in this case territories. So the replacement zones are maintained by high territoriality and interspecific competition, interference competition. Now, there are instances where species are not territorial and they actually co-occur in the same zone. So you can have situations where there is no replacement zone. You can have species that are there at low elevations, you can have species that are there at high elevation, and some overlap between the um, elevation ranges of species. And this especially happens when species are not territorial. And therefore they're not showing aggression towards each other, and so they coexist in this at certain elevation. In practice, what is the length of the line for line transact and effective radius? I think we dealt with this in the previous session where we talked about sampling methods for censuses and sampling methods. So if you can please go to that recording, then these questions have been answered there. If you have any questions regarding the conservation biology and bird conservation biology, then we can take those here.
I think for now, avian conservation questions, you can start posting them, but I don't know how to answer them.
Yeah, I think you can type them into the chat box, everyone, or you could just raise your hand. And there don't seem to be too many people here today, so you could just raise your hand and ask the question directly.
Yeah. So have you this thing? I might have missed this thing. Sachin question, the line transact method. Have you addressed it?
Yes, this has been addressed in the session where we talked about sampling bird populations and bird communities. But it's there in that recording. In practice, though, the length of the line varies between 250 to 500 meters, and the effective radius actually comes from the data. It's not actually set beforehand. It comes from the distribution of the distances at which individuals have been sighted. And so, there's a more detailed explanation in the recording that deals with sampling and censusing bird populations and communities. So please do take a look at that.
Uh,
Hello, sir.
uh,
This is
yes, yes, Krishnendu. You can.
yes. This is Krishnendu from Tripura. I just had one question regarding trapping of jungle fowl here. Hunters who engage themselves regularly in these activities, they report that when chased, these birds they take flight intermittently, and the females are reported to take 5 flights. They take one and land after a certain distance, and they take another if chased. And females are reported to take 5 such flights, and not after that, not any after that. And males are reported to have 3. So, is there any study which has documented this behavior of these birds? As you work in Arunachal, in the range also coincides with.
I haven't come across anything like this. I have spoken with a number of hunters in Arunachal Pradesh, um, but this particular thing about the red jungle fowl is something that I have not come across. But Krishna, though I'm going back to Arunachal Pradesh soon. I'll speak to some of the hunters there and see if there's any behavior like this that they're familiar with. I haven't come across anything like this, but but this reminds me of something similar, but not exactly what you're talking about, which is flight distances. flight distances
Yes.
have been used quite regularly as a proxy for human disturbance. So basically, when there's hunting, birds will not allow you to approach very close by, so they'll take flight when you're far away. In the locations where there's no hunting, you can actually approach birds to much closer flight distances. And that's been used very often to sort of understand what the pressures in terms of hunting and human use that's
Yes, I mean, but what surprises me is the number. It's three for males and five for females. I mean, how can they be so assured that the number? But the number of people that I have spoken to, I mean, they are fixed on this number. Then this number three and five, these do not vary. So that puts quite a lot of interest in this, but I could not find any source which could relate to this behavior. And as your in your lecture, I saw that birds that face multiple pressures at a particular habitat. I mean, here what we find is trapping and forest burning. These forest fires, these are man-made fires, and these are used as an aid to trap. There are several methods which are used to trap jungle fowl and similar other birds, and and this is when this behavior is documented. The area that they select to trap these birds is actually quite large. So the a team of people involved is also large. So I think it's a very well documented thing, at least amongst hunters in Tripura. But I could not find any scientific evidence of this. So please mention if you find.
Yes, I'll definitely get in touch with you if I find anything similar in Arunachal. Of course, yeah, this is fascinating. And, hunters really know the natural history and the behavior of these species really, really well, right? I mean, if you need to hunt something, you need to know it very, very well. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if this turns out to be entirely true. And, local communities have absolutely fantastic knowledge, the kind of knowledge that we as ornithologists um, rarely invest time in studying because they tend to be very natural history oriented, right? And the natural history knowledge of communities living in the forest and communities living with birds is absolutely magnificent. And yeah, I will try to confirm if there's any this kind of behavior in red jungle fowl or other pheasants in Arunachal.
One more thing, I read somewhere that the genetic purity of red jungle fowl can be understood by the presence of eclipse plumage. So, has there been any study in the Northeast relating to the genetic purity of the population that we have here around?
Not to my knowledge, but I think there are studies from Southeast Asia that have looked at genetic purity of red jungle fowl and how to what extent they've hybridized potentially with domestic fowl.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Uh, oh, we got a question in the chat box from Roosbay. Is the pressure on vulnerable or threatened bird species from bird tourism being adequately researched? No doubt bird tourism has a positive role to play. It's the other side being overlooked or not understood adequately. So bird tourism, uh, one, the pressure on vulnerable or threatened bird species from bird tourism being adequately researched in India? No. Um, but in the neotropics in the Amazon and the Andes, to an extent, yes. Um, so one of the things with bird tourism is the use of what's called playback. Now, a lot of birds, especially in forests, are not easy to see. They're in the undergrowth, they're in dense vegetation. So to be able to show tourists these skulking birds that are, in thick vegetation, what bird guides will do is that they will often play the territorial song of that species, and the individual in that territory will then respond to the song, because the song signifies. The song is basically a bird telling other birds that this is my territory, stay away. And so birds will respond aggressively to the taped song. So these tapes are played often, and sometimes these tapes are played, you know, for a very, very long time. And that can potentially have disruptive effects on the bird. Right? The bird, instead of spending time foraging or spending time on the nest, is forced to now respond to these states. And so, activities that it would have otherwise invested time in are now being deprioritized to spend more time responding to these calls, and that can be a huge problem. The influence of these states and human disturbance on birds is mixed. In some places, they found that some studies have found that whether you clear tape or not, it doesn't really matter. So they've done experiments where they've looked at body condition of birds that have been exposed to these tapes versus body condition of birds that have not been exposed to tapes, and they found no differences. Others have found slight reductions in body quality or body condition because of taping. Uh, so the evidence so far is mixed. You would expect to see impacts of these kinds of activities, but the evidence so far is mixed. Now, bird tourism, that's one aspect of bird tourism, right? The fact that you play these tapes. But there could be other aspects of bird tourism as well that can be harmful. Just the sheer number of human beings going out and looking for birds can cause habitat use to change. These are again, with the rise of bird tourism, these are again important questions to answer. And if there are any of you here who are interested in research, interested in taking up questions like this, then these really are questions that need to be addressed. You're welcome.
Miss, can I ask you a question? Like
Yes,
from
yes,
my
please
side
go ahead.
also.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a foundation questions. I just wanted to know, like how you approach, like the steps you take in, for instance, for a specific species, you want for a conservation like approach. So, what are the first steps that you took for they need to be taken for the in approaching, like for instance, you approach first to the forest department, or either you first study the behavior of the species and then approach, or either you have some documentation regarding the like vulnerability of the species or something like that, like
Right.
so.
So, I can speak for Arunachal Pradesh and this particular instance where there's this bird called the Bugun leochicla. And the Bugun leochicla has a global population of not more than 20 individuals that we know of. So there's about twice as many Bugun leochiclas as there are people on this call in the world. And the known range size of the species just 2 square kilometers. So that to begin with, we knew that this bird, as far as we know, has an extremely tiny range, has very few individuals, and so therefore the protection of its habitat is to begin with a top priority. Um, the habitat was actually not owned and administered by the forest department. It was owned and it is continues to be owned and administered by the Bugun community of a village called Singchung in Arunachal Pradesh. And so we approached the community first. Uh, and the Bogoliya Chukla is very important economically as well because a lot of people come just to see the Bogoliya Chukla. So we approached the community and suggested uh, and asked them if they would be willing to set aside some of this land to protect the Bogoliya Chukla. So the first step there was just saying to begin with where the Leochicla is, we need to protect that. Now, if that is the case, and the Bogun Leochicla needs to shift its range upwards because of climate change to higher elevations, then we need to protect elevations that are higher than where the Bogun Leochicla is found as well. And so we went to the community, we said, so it's likely, here's the evidence that birds are moving up, and it's likely that the Bogun Leochicla will also need to move up to be resilient to climate change. And so therefore we need to protect an elevation gradient that allows the bird to move up. and that elevation gradient to the ridge line ideally should not be touched. And so that was the second step of saying perhaps it's not enough to just protect these 2 square kilometers. We need to protect an environment and an elevational gradient. So that is the second step. And so over time, the community has set aside 17 square kilometers as a community reserve. And now they're actually adding another 15 square kilometers to bring the total area under protection to 32 square kilometers. But again, this is not land that has gone to the state government. It's not land that is now owned by the forest department. It's still owned and managed by the community reserve management committee. So it's not like our national parks where it's all no go. Here, depending on how the community sees fit to actually protect this area or to make further changes or maybe even de-recognize the area, that the community can do because the management is entirely with the community. It's not with the forest department. So it's not the way that it operates in most of India. Right? In most of India, land is either under private control or it's under government control. And under government controlled lands are protected areas like wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. Whereas in large parts of Northeast India, because of special provisions of the constitution, and Sonia, you're familiar with this, I'm sure, land management is very decentralized. And in Arunachal, the land management is at the level of the village. And so our first step was to speak to members of the village council about conservation rather than speaking to the government directly. Well, the village council itself is an arm of the government in Arunachal. So it's a Gram Panchayat, right? So that in itself is mandated and is a governmental body. So we're speaking with the government, but we're actually speaking with Gram Panchayats because the ownership of the land is highly decentralized in Arunachal and many other parts of the northeastern states. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you for the answer. I like detail this thing. I think I will formally interact with you if it is not okay with you. I will email you and like
Sure, certainly.
discuss in details. We can, yeah,
Sure.
there will be great. Thank you. I think
Okay.
we have questions from Karnika Palwa, I
Yes,
guess. So
Anita has a
I
question.
will
She
leave it to
asked,
you.
yeah, thanks, Sonia. Typically, there are more than one species of sentinel species in a single mixed species. No, like a bronco as well as a falcon in the same flock, will they replace each other in the other's absence? There could be more than one sentinel species, and the fact that species are good sentinels can arise from multiple mechanisms. I'll just lay out two over here. One of the mechanisms that makes a species a sentinel could be the fact that it eats insects that are flying, right? And because it eats insects that are flying, like brongos will chase insects that are flying. Because it's keeping a lookout for insects that are in flight, it's not got its head stuck in the vegetation, right? It's not buried in leaves and looking for insects on the undersides of leaves. It's actually scanning the environment continuously. That also makes it more likely to pick up predators easier. Yeah. Um, and so that could be one kind of sentinel species. The other kinds of sentinels are species like palmettos could be sentinels. These are species that are interspecifically gregarious. So they will be in family groups. So there'll be parents and the offspring from that generation. So you might have a family group of 6 or 8 Nepal palmettos in a mixed lot. And the reason why they might warn against predators is because of something called kin selection, which is something you would have come across in the evolution part of this course, which is I share genes with my offspring, and my offspring share genes with me. And so I would want to warn my offspring about the presence of a predator. So simply that relatedness might make species that are gregarious more likely to warn individuals of that species against predation. Will they replace each other in the other's absence? It's likely, yes. We often see, for example, here's a natural experiment. You've got an elevational gradient, and you've got a certain set of mixed species, a certain composition of mixed species flocks at low elevations. And the low elevation flocks have lesser racket-tailed bronco as a very good sentinel. Now, when you move up to a higher elevation, you've not got lesser articulated bronco, but you've got other species in the mixed flock that are there at the low elevation. So the sentinel species drops out at some elevation, but the other species are still there in the flock. And there you might be replaced. The lesser articulated bronco might be replaced by white-throated fantail, which is a good sentinel. So the flocks we think so far are not all that. It's not like if there are these six species, it's going to be these six species only. There is quite a lot of fluidity in which species are participating in these flocks, and that will also depend on various other things, right? So if the resource availability is very high, maybe I don't need to spend that much time looking for resources, because every time I look, I find resources. So I can actually spend time looking out for predators because resource availability is high. And if that resource availability is high, and I don't need to spend that much time looking for resources, then I don't need to associate with the sentinel because I'm good enough doing it myself. If resources are low, though, I need to invest a lot of time looking for food, and I don't have the time to look out for predators. And so, therefore, in that situation, I might be forced to join the sentinel. So it's quite a fluid thing, mixed flocks. Are they likely to compete for the role? Um, I don't think the sentinels are actively competing for roles in the flock. Uh, Again, whether you're with the sentinel or not might depend on external conditions, right? Uh, uh, Food availability, predation pressure, and so on. But I don't think that they would be competing with each other for the role. The reason why they won um, is different in different cases. Now, for example, a drongo warning against a predator, uh, that warning has to be an honest signal, what's called an honest signal. So drongo keeps making false alarm calls. Then over time, what's going to happen is the birds that are associated with the drongos are also going to say like, "ये झूठ बोल रहा है, this is a false alarm," and so I get nothing from associating with the drongo. So the signals have to be honest, by and large. The other situation where the palmettos are warning each other because they're related, because of kin selection. Uh, so the motivation for warning is different. Um, but what birds are doing is basically eavesdropping, right? So if a falmeta is, I'm a falmeta and I'm warning a fellow falmeta about a predator, then three other species could hear that warning and just eavesdrop basically. Say, this is the reliable signal. If they're warning each other, it means there's a predator around, and I should also be the person. That kind of thing that's happening. Panraj has a question asking if there's any change in migratory bird duration of stay in migrating place, because global warming. Yes, there is. We know this, that in multiple species, more and more individuals are actually overwintering in their breeding sites. So earlier, where most of the population would breed, leave, go to a wintering site, and then return to breed, what we're seeing now is a lot of overwintering. So we're seeing that birds that breed at high latitudes are also spending winters at more. A larger proportion of birds are also spending their winters at high latitude. So there is change happening in both the timing of migration as well as the duration of the stay of migration because of climate change. Another question about from Pundraj again, a brief about the model caterpillar study. So like this plastic one, it will not harm the birds if swallowed by larger birds. Yeah, I know it's harmless. The caterpillars are harmless. They're just models of caterpillars that was placed in the habitat. And birds will first attack those caterpillars, and only if they find that these caterpillars are real and palatable will they actually swallow them. So these birds, after attacking, they realize that this is not a real caterpillar and they're not going to eat them. Uh, but even if swallowed, they're non-toxic. I don't think it's going to harm the larger birds either. Sandy has a question. The intervening years when the birds weren't recaptured, 000, might have died or the tags lost. Yes, the tag loss is a possibility, although it's not really a problem with small passerine birds, because once the ring is placed, it's not going anywhere. The bird can't take it off. In other situations, there might be tag loss. Social animals, you put a collar, and some other individual in the population removes the collar, and so tags are lost. But that doesn't happen with birds. Typically, tags are not lost in these cases. If you've got captures that going from 1 1 1 1 and then all zeros, we don't know whether the individual has either died or it's not been captured or it's permanently left the data or left the area, right? So it could be one of these three things. It's alive but it's not been captured, it's died, or it's left, and therefore it's not even available for capture. Is there anybody less than the number of birds missed? Doesn't the credibility of sampling become questionable owing to the birds missed? I mean, there might be so much more birds than we assume skewing the data. Right. So, what we do is to try and maximize the probability of captures, right? That means putting out a large number of misnets. It means misnetting for a longer time. Um, the what happens if you have small amounts of data? Let's say you only recapture 10% of the population, right? Then your recapture probability is only 0.1, right? 10%. When your recapture probability is low, now remember, survival and recapture probability are estimated jointly, right? You're asking what is the probability of getting this kind of capture history if survival probability is this value and recapture probability is this value. So if you have a capture history 1 1 1 1 1, for example, then recapture probability is very high, right? So a process where survival is low and recapture is low is not going to generate a capture history of 1 1 1 1 1 1 1, right? You're capturing this bird if it's alive. So survival probability is high and recapture probability is high. And so what happens is you confront when you say survival can range between 0 and 1, capture probability can range between 0 and 1, where in this space is most likely to generate this kind of data. Now, if you have low levels of recapture probability, then your uncertainty in the estimates of survival will be high. So you might be able to estimate survival. Let's say survival rate is 40%, but your uncertainty in that 40% estimate will be high. So the model might tell you the average survival rate is 40%, but it could be anything between 15% to 65%, and then you're unsure about what exactly the true value is. Whereas if you maximize recapture probability, then your estimates of survival rates will also be much more precise. The estimates you'll be more certain of those estimates. Um, so I wouldn't say the credibility of sampling is questionable. What really becomes an issue is that the uncertainty in the estimates is higher when you have lower capture probability. The uncertainty in the estimates is lower when you have high capture probability. Uh, in practice, our capture probabilities for the birds that we analyze are between 40 and 50% recapture probability. So we recapture about half the birds that we capture in the first occasion. Um, yes, again, Prashanti says in line transit method, it's a given that species are always uniformly distributed in the study area. How can we be so sure? Um, for many species, we can't, and therefore the line transit method doesn't work for many species because they're non-randomly distributed in the habitat, they're non-uniformly distributed in the habitat. But for territorial passerines, forest birds, forest passerines, in general, the placement of the line, the assumption is that the placement of the line is random related to the distribution of the individuals. And yeah, and for forest passerines that are breeding, especially, and they have territories, it's I think a safe assumption. But there will be a number of species that are non-uniformly distributed in the habitat for which you can't use line transits. Kartika has another question. Climate change is likely to increase the intensity and frequency of cyclones, likely to affect rainfall patterns, and in what different ways is all this affecting bird populations? Climate change is likely to increase the intensity and frequency of cyclones. Yes, that's a direct consequence of there being more energy in the atmosphere and more energy being absorbed by the world's oceans. And therefore, that energy has to go out somewhere, right? And that's what gives rise to cyclones and hurricanes and so on. Rainfall patterns, yes, it's going to affect rainfall patterns differently in different locations. What's going to happen in South Asia, where we are, um, is that most likely this is going to be the scenario is that the amount of rainfall over the year is going to be the same, but that rainfall is going to be compressed into shorter and shorter time periods. So where you have the monsoon going from June to September, June, July, August, September, four months of the monsoon, and earlier you had rainfall occurring during the monsoon uniformly across those 4 months. What's going to happen now is that rainfall is going to become concentrated over shorter time periods. So you might have an intense event of rainfall lasting 3 days and then no rainfall for a month. And then again, you have an intense event of rainfall lasting 3 or 4 days and then no rainfall for 15 days. So the rainfall is going to become concentrated. The same amount of rain is going to become concentrated into a smaller time interval. And so you're going to have more floods and more droughts, uh, right? Because you have longer dry periods and shorter rainfall periods. So severe flooding interspersed with drought. In what ways is this affecting bird populations? Um, it depends on what the bird population is. Now, these extreme events are often localized, right? You're not going to have extreme rainfall events, at least. You're not likely to have an extreme rainfall event that has that you know that occurs over the entire country. For example, you might have an extreme rainfall event in Western Arunachal Pradesh. So how it's going to affect bird populations depends on two things. What is the geographical range of the bird population? What is the local abundance of the bird population? And typically, what you see is that birds are rare. Rare birds are rare in two ways. They're rare because their population densities are low, but they're also rare because they're geographically restricted. And so, bird populations that are small and geographically restricted are vulnerable to both. And this would have come across in both the conservation as well as the population and ecology class. They're vulnerable to two kinds of randomness, uh, which are fancily called demographic stochasticity and environmental stochasticity. Environmental stochasticity is what Karnika is talking about here, where you've got these extreme rainfall events. And because you have this environmental stochasticity affecting this particular location, any species that is restricted to that location, or the population that is restricted to that location, is vulnerable to extinction. Whereas a species that has a larger population, larger geographical range, uh, is not going to be vulnerable so much to environmental stochasticity because only a part of its range is going to be affected by these extreme rainfall events. So it depends on what kind of species we're talking about in terms of geographical range as well as population size.
I think, yeah, we are almost this thing into the timeline, I guess. And this is not related to the topics, this thing, but there is a doubt from Sattarsi. He wanted to know about the assignment. He's like, uh, the question was related to the type of competition. Which of the following is not a type of competition? So, in that, the following options were given: interference in A option, in B option, exploitation, in C option, there's keystone, and D option is apparent. And the correct answer was apparent. And based on that, he asked the questions. He was confused. I guess I will pose the
No,
question.
no,
So,
the answer is keystone.
answer is keystone.
The answer is keystone.
Then,
So Saptarshi is
that is
right.
this thing from our side, I guess. Satoshi is right.
I
Okay.
Saptarshi is
think
right.
Yeah.
in that
Thank you.
particular
Then
week,
I have to.
I think in that particular week,
Uh,
we had problems with two
Uh,
questions. One is this particular question that
okay.
Mr. Saptarshi has raised. There was another question I don't
Uh,
remember, but I think I'll post that. There were two questions.
There have been already addressed by the Mosmi, I guess. So, in the
Okay.
discussion forum regarding this particular week, there was another this thing, but the question has been already addressed by Dr. Mosmi. So I think it
Okay.
was
Okay.
okay. Got it.
Thank you.
So, I'll this thing handle this problem, I guess, with the NPTEL team. So the correct answer should be this. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying, Umesh. Then. Mm. We still have like 10 minutes, everyone. So I think you can still post your questions, or if you don't have any further questions, then we can also wrap up this session.
Yeah, if there are no further questions, if you have any questions, please raise your hand right now so that we know we need to stay. And there will be a question posted in the chat box. If there are no further questions, then we'll just wait for a minute and wrap this up then. And as always, thank you to Sonia and to the studio team for setting this up, and thanks to everybody for joining in. And I hope you got some insights from this session and the other session.
Thank you, Umesh, for always. I think, shall we wait for a few minutes, or shall we?
Yeah, I think nobody's raised a hand, so I think we can wrap this up.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you
Umesh.
so much.
Thank you, everyone. Then
Thank,
we will end this session here then. Okay. Bye bye.
thanks everyone. Bye.